The fact the United States had been a former colony of Great Britain made it difficult for its political leaders to justify colonization. More significant than adherence to American democratic principles, although related, was Thomas Jefferson's Northwest Ordinance. It permitted all territories of the United States to apply for statehood when such territories had gained the proper number of inhabitants. The Northwest Ordinance motivated Congress in the late 1840s to oppose the annexation of Mexico south of the Rio Grande. Politicians feared the conquest of a region populated by massive amounts of Roman Catholics, and savage indigents would lead to the mongrelization of Congress if ever the residents gained representation. Such jingoism jeopardized the demographic stability of the Senate. You heard correct, many 19th century American leaders were such racists that they rejected empire. That is, if having an empire came at the cost of incorporating more non-whites into the fabric of their society. When President Grant proposed purchasing a peninsula in the Dominican Republic, opponents in the New York Herald warned the American public that the people of the Dominican Republic were a turbulent, treacherous race, indolent, and not disposed to make themselves useful to their country or to the world at large. President Grant's Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, agreed. He also cautioned senators eager to occupy Cuba. With its present population, the island of Cuba will be anything else than a desirable acquisition to the United States. And I can see no means of getting rid of a population of some 450,000 so-called white, but really of every shade and mixture of color, who own all the land on the island. Americans' quest for world power was complicated, yet anxiety about the cultural ways of non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants failed to arrest the American romanticism for taming a frontier. The allure of a frontier attracted specifically middle-class American males whom Victorian society and bourgeois leisure had detached from the masculinity of their forefathers. In his History of How the United States Won the West, Theodore Roosevelt inspired fascination with the frontier. He aroused equal admiration for the white men and red, who in Roosevelt's 1890 interpretation fought one another whenever they met and displayed in their conflicts all the cunning and merciless ferocity that made forest warfare so dreadful. He jealously described the bodies of the contestants, who had sinewy frames and iron wills, keen eyes and steady hands, hearts as bold as they were ruthless. For Americans born after the Civil War, physically and intellectually detached from the horror and carnage of battle, such narratives pulled them to an ideal of American empire. Frederick Jackson Turner, in an essay read to the American Historical Association in 1893, but popularized among the literate classes, curtailed racial fears of occupying lands inhabited by non-whites. He academically asserted the frontier is the line of most rapid Americanization. Many of the same individuals who fretted about the long-term consequences of incorporating diverse populations into the fabric of American society also craved the adventure that, according to the people who studied the frontier, like Turner, constituted the steady growth of independence on American lines. It appeared to many decision makers that the American character required the United States to compete for global markets. At the intersection of racial prejudice and international competitiveness, Americans innovatively approached foreign relations with the proposal that they could mentor lesser races, that is, people ethnically not white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant, into achieving democratic and republican forms of government. The opportunity to compete against European imperialism arrived when Spain lost its grasp over Cuba. Cuban rebels had struggled against Spanish domination since the 1860s. By the early 1890s, José Martí, via the Cuban Revolutionary Party, had introduced a novel political platform that pushed to transcend social and racial differences among Cubans. He advocated the equality of black and white Cubans, thus cementing a nationalism without class and race. This new approach to independence gained the Cuban Revolutionary Party respect. The instability of Spain to compromise with the Revolutionary Party threatened the investments of American businesses on the island, which approached some $50 million by 1895. An admirer of American revolutionary ideals, Martí and the party recognized that this economic interference presented a potential threat to Cuban independence. The Cuban Revolutionary Party adamantly opposed U.S. influence on Cuban independence if the result would diminish Cuban sovereignty. American interest in the island was not solely economic. Newspaper tycoons like William Randolph Hearst drew the attention of the American public with sensationalist and bold headlines on the atrocities of Spanish governor Valeriano Wheeler. The familiarity Cuban nationalists shared with the founding generation called the American public. Cuban rebels engaged in guerrilla tactics that frustrated the Spanish army. They subsisted on food provided by local peasants and easily assimilated into rural communities, making it impossible for Wheeler's army to distinguish rebel from peasant. This strategy made it hard for Spain to quell the rebellion. Spain elected Governor General Wheeler to take the war to the local communities, teach them a lesson that their loyalty belongs solely to Spain and the crown. General Wheeler ruthlessly deprived the rebels of their source of subsistence by forcing peasant populations to relocate to poorly built government camps. Within these confinements, many peasants starved and government officials tortured others suspected of treason. Reports of General Wheeler's crimes made for good old American political entertainment as it stressed the archaic methods of Spain. Henry Brooks Adam explained, "Between the Americans and the Spaniards, no permanent friendship could exist. Their systems were at war, even when the nations were at peace." Yellow journalism on the Cuban Revolution did much to perpetuate this view. Adams opposed all European manifestations of imperialism, but Spain's style appeared to him the most corrupt and menacing. He affirmed, Spain, France, and England combined in maintaining the old colonial system, and Spain, as the greatest owner of American territory, that is, territory in the Western Hemisphere, was more deeply interested than any other power in upholding the rule that colonies belonged exclusively to the mother country and might trade only with her. Thus, Spain was a natural rival on the path the United States followed to earn international credibility. The Spanish Empire interfered with American economic hegemony in the Caribbean and the principles of self-determination Americans intended to spread through the Western Hemisphere. While the American business community worried about the limits Spain placed on the economic expansion of U.S. trade, Spain's style of political rule in Cuba and Puerto Rico mattered more to the reading American public. Perhaps the story that attracted the greatest attention was the imprisonment of the young and beautiful Evangelina Cisneros. At 18 years of age, Cisneros had become involved with the Cuban revolutionary movement. Spanish officials accused her of conspiring to murder a Spanish colonel, and many suspected she would get some 20 years in one of Spain's harshest colonial prisons. William Hearst petitioned for her release. The petition campaign gained readership for Hearst's New York Journal, exciting even the condemnation of President McKinley's mother. When the campaign failed, Hearst turned the story into a damsel in distress tale and sent the handsome reporter Carl Decker to break her out of prison and bring her to the United States. The plan worked. Cisneros became an American celebrity overnight. American newspapers profited from this narrative of beautiful Lady Cuba begging the macho Uncle Sam, the United States, to protect her from the villainy of Wheeler the Butcher. Such perspectives would have disturbed Cuban rebels who were proud of their patriarchal traditions, but it filled American middle-class males with pride. American leaders did not want colony, but they also did not want Europe to monopolize them. The latter threatened U.S. economic interests by blocking American businesses from potential markets. Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, senator from Massachusetts, and close friend of Theodore Roosevelt, warned, "The great nations of the earth are competing in a desperate struggle for the world's trade, and in that competition, we must not be left behind. In the economic struggle, the great nations of Europe for many years have been seizing all the waste places and all the weakly held lands of the earth as the surest means of trade development." If Spain lost to Cuban nationalists, many American political leaders feared whatever government Cubans established, it would fail to keep Europe's thirst for territory at bay. They may not have had in mind to colonize Cuba, but they were quite optimistic that they could be a hegemonic force to guide a racially inferior and effeminate people to assimilate to the democratic and republican ways of the United States. U.S. leaders decided to relate with Cubans who faced the threat of European colonizations as they dealt with foreigners domestically by attempting to assimilate them to American cultural ways. They wanted the colonies to gain independence, yes, but it was to be an independence Americans would determine based on their perception that Cubans were prepared for the responsibilities of self-sovereignty. Redfield Proctor, senator from Vermont, urged Americans to avoid the criminal blunder made in the past, when we bestowed with unthinking liberalism the highest privilege of Anglo-Saxon freedom upon an illiterate alien race just emerging from bondage, and thus prevented the placing of the rights of suffrage upon an educational basis applicable to whites and blacks alike. With one stroke, Senator Proctor categorized Cubans as in the same condition as African Americans post-emancipation and used the failures of Reconstruction, which resulted in segregation and second-class citizenship for blacks, to justify not granting Cuba immediate sovereignty until American institutions educated them into the ways of the modern world. Some African Americans recognized how war in Cuba and the Philippines served to maintain the racial status quo in the United States. The Indianapolis Freeman asked blacks to think twice before enlisting in this war without first being guaranteed by the United States government freedom and equality before the law as other American citizens. Domestically, the Reconstruction of the South had left African Americans to fend for themselves against the narrow interpretations of the U.S. Constitution by Southern states. Internationally, the Reconstruction of Cuba and the image of the U.S. appeared as Americans supporting the independence and self-determination of European colonies. Yet to the nations under this American tutelage, these people were made to feel effeminate, childish, and racially inferior. It was easy for Cubans like African Americans to sense that the U.S. government practiced diplomatic backsliding. By early 1898, the situation in Cuba had become so tense that President William McKinley sent the USS Maine to the Havana harbor to protect American interests in the island. On February 15, the Maine exploded. American newspapers quickly blamed the Spanish government, hyping up American audiences with cries of "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Later investigation revealed that a malfunction in the ship caused the explosion. Yet this realization was in retrospect. On April 20, Congress authorized the U.S. military to assist Cuban nationalists. Spain declared war on the U.S. 4 days later. Many Cuban nationalists viewed these developments with suspicion. They petitioned in the United States to assure intervention would respect American sovereignty. A spokesman for the Cuban nationalists warned Congress, intervention without previous recognition of independence will be conceived as a declaration of war by the United States against the Cuban revolutionaries. Senator Henry S. Teller sympathized with this concern and pushed an amendment that forbid the United States to annex any Cuban territory. This was the Teller Amendment. The diplomacy that defined the end of the Spanish-American War revealed the United States in an identity crisis. They opposed a world ruled by imperialist diplomacy but hoped to gain economic access to Europe's colonies. In Cuba, the U.S. military was influenced by the lessons of Southern Reconstruction and by the ethnic makeup of the revolutionaries. The Cuban rebels were every tone between beige and brown, while the Spanish armies were stereotypical blonde, blue-eyed Europeans. When Spain surrendered, American leaders forbid Cuban rebels from participating in the peace treaty in Santiago. American ostracism disillusioned General Calixto Garcia about American democratic principles. He condemned General William Shafter for preventing the Cuban people from electing the new authorities of an independent Cuba. Instead, Shafter allowed the same officials who the Queen of Spain elected to remain in power until American diplomats assured a stable transition. General Garcia recognized that at the bottom of this decision was American bigotry. He denounced a rumor too absurd to be believed, describes the reason for your measures, and of the orders forbidding my army to enter Santiago for fear of massacres and revenge against the Spaniards. American officials perceived Cuban rebels as brutish barbarians, but General Garcia elegantly reminded Shafter, "Allow me, sir, to protest against even the shadow of such an idea. We are not savages, ignoring the rules of civilized warfare. We are a poor, ragged army, as ragged and poor as was the army of your forefathers in their noble war for independence." Thus, the United States failed to establish confidence in American intentions and assumed a responsibility over Cuba that not all Americans agreed was worth the trouble. Some American leaders apprehensively interpreted the expansion of duties Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden. The emancipation of the American slave and the black citizenship that followed. The senator from South Carolina, Ben Pinchfork Tillman, reminded the Senate in 1898 was still a burden. Although they have been granted the franchise, we are not responsible because we inherited it, and your fathers as well as ours are responsible for the presence among us of that people. He warned his contemporaries not to make future American generations responsible for the welfare of the innately inferior Cubans. From such an angle, what the British gained by an empire where the sun always rises was unattractive. It was crude, in fact, from the Tillman outlook because of its economic inefficiency and the racial threat it posed by the incorporation into our citizenship 10 millions more of different or of differing races. But for Americans more optimistic about the promises of assimilation, they conceived of foreign markets as dumping grounds for the surplus of America. In the 1870s, U.S. businesses exported $450 million in goods. By the early 1890s, exports increased beyond the billion-dollar mark. Minnesota's Catholic Archbishop John Ireland, who advocated the Americanization of Catholicism, also trumpeted a new order of things. America is too great to be isolated from the world around her and beyond her, Ireland insisted. She is a world power to whom no world interest is alien, whose voice reaches afar, whose spirit travels across seas and mountain ranges to most distinct continents and islands. This was a direct attack on the United States' traditional policy of isolation, what men like Tillman craved for Americans to return to. Newspaperman Whitelaw Reid explicitly praised in 1898 the financial benefits of American annexation of the Philippines. Commanding both sides of the Pacific and the available coal supplies on each, the U.S. commands the ocean that, according to the old prediction, is to bear the bulk of the world's commerce in the 20th century. Americans clearly differed on how the United States would proceed in a world shaped by the diplomacy of aggressive imperialist nations. The declaration of war on Spain opened the possibility of U.S. influence in the Pacific. Like in Cuba, Spain held on to the Philippines by a thread as Filipino nationalists demanded independence. On May 1, 1898, Commodore George Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet in Manila. He made a verbal promise to Filipino nationalist General Emilio Aguinaldo that the United States would respect an independent Philippines. However, Filipino nationalists never received the contractual confirmation of a Teller Amendment. Hence, while limited in its level of intervention in Cuba, the United States had a freer hand in the Philippines. At the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, many American leaders enthusiastically consented to the purchase of the Philippines for $20 million. George Dewey's promises to General Emilio Aguinaldo were hollow. President McKinley sold Americans on this transaction with the prospect that the Philippines would be an American protectorate, not a colony. He maintained the stance that the U.S. had cared nothing for the possession of the Philippines. The truth is, I didn't want them, McKinley asserted. When they came to us as a gift from the gods, I did not know what to do with it. And I'm not ashamed to tell you that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. President McKinley's narrative stressed the idea that the U.S. shunned global power, but the invisible hand of history, God, forced American leaders into this position. The American public, if they heard the president's proclamations, would have recognized an underlying message. The U.S., as an exceptional nation blessed with a superior political and economic system, had the Christian obligation to serve as a model for the world to follow. McKinley asked for the sacrifice of the American public. From 1899 to 1903, U.S. soldiers will struggle against Filipino insurgents who opposed American occupation. The sacrifice the president demanded was literal. While the United States was shunned being a colonial power, it still would protect its foreign market prospects around the globe by transforming the world into its image. President McKinley's rhetoric fit well with the Puritan desire to be a city upon the hill. He delineated the choices he faced in deciding the fate of U.S.-Philippine relations. 1. That we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. 2. That we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business and discreditable. 3. That we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule over there worse than Spain's was. And 4. That there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. By defining Filipinos as individuals for which Christ died, McKinley humanized them even if they remain a lesser race to the American mind. That the Philippines had been a former colony of Spain constituted the first step to Americanize Filipinos. They followed in the footsteps of the United States, a former colony of Britain. God selected the U.S. as the most civilized and advanced nation because many Americans believed its level of democracy and industrialism determined it to lend a hand and assist the Philippine people. The debt the Philippines paid for this mentoring or this middle ground between colony and independence would be that it kept its markets open to U.S. business interest and closed to any nation Americans defined as predatory. Filipino nationalists viewed American posturing as a declaration of war. General Aguinaldo authorized an article to be published in the North American Review, where he intended to set the record straight. Directly addressing the racism of American officials in the Philippines, he assured the American public, "You have been greatly deceived in the personality of my countrymen. You went to the Philippines under the impression that their inhabitants were ignorant savages. We have been represented by your popular press as if we were Africans or Mohawk Indians. We smile and deplore the want of ethnological knowledge on the part of your literary friends. We are none of these. We are simply Filipinos." Yet being Filipino equaled being a non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And for nationalists as such, the only hope they had of being free from foreign influence was allowing the American mentoring of the Philippines into civilization. Aguinaldo's representative laid the situation bare. Now, here is a unique spectacle: the Filipinos fighting for liberty, and the American people fighting them to give them liberty. This was the problem with American diplomatic tutelage. It happened at gunpoint and hurt the people whom Americans preached to help. Regardless of what American intentions were, such diplomacy bred resentment and led the U.S. to lose credibility with the people whose hearts they hoped to win. Filipino nationalists were serious about independence. The American inability to comprehend the Filipino mind resulted in 4 grueling years of war, where 4,200 American soldiers died. The populist politician William Jennings Bryan asked, "Will it pay?" He concluded that the annexation of the Philippines would instead create heavier taxes, increase Asiatic immigration into the continent, laborers who would compete for American jobs, and increase the opportunity to furnish more sons for the army. More than the occupations of Cuba, American intervention in the Philippines was the beginning of the end of American diplomatic innocence. At least William James believed. He reminisced how we used to believe then that we were of a different clay from other nations, that there was something deep in the American heart that answered to our happy birth, free from that hereditary burden which the nations of Europe bear and which obliges them to grow by preying on their neighbors. For James, this was pure 4th of July fancy. Yet the truth was, if we can accept the declarations of American leaders, that the U.S. did not intend to prey but only police the world. Of course, this policing had different interpretations depending on what side of the fence people stood. The relativity of American politics and diversity of American demands made for a contradictory experiment in international relations. During the late 19th century, some American leaders devised a plan to compete against European imperialism without contradicting their national philosophy of self-determination. The problem with this plan surfaced when the colonized people Americans hoped to mentor accepted the principles of self-determination and voiced their impatience with American tutelage. This strategy, while certainly a source of international power, in time it also became a diplomatic threat.